Topics in Chapter 8, Volume 2. The purchase of Graystone, spelled G-R-A-Y not G-R-E-Y. Dinner to J.S. Morgan. Mr. Tilden rebukes third-term candidates for the presidency. Withdraws from public life. Letter to Mr. Manning declaring the presidential nomination in 1880. The Cincinnati Convention. Urged for a renomination in 1884. Second letter of declension. In the summer of 1879 Mr. Tilden thought to benefit his health by establishing a home, for at least a portion of the year, in the country. He leased for the summer, and before the expiration of the lease purchased, the noble estate since widely known as Graystone at Yonkers, on the Hudson, then about 3 miles beyond the northernmost limit of New York City. The property consisted of 63 1/3 acres of land, and a palatial stone dwelling which had been recently finished, on the highest ground on the river's bank south of Highlands. To this estate he subsequently added 48 adjoining acres. The structure, the view, the air, the facilities of access to the city, everything about the place, was suited to his taste and his needs. If he had not by this time abandoned all thought of returning to public life, he had ceased to regard such a prospect with pleasure. He found all the employment and recreation he required in improving and stocking his new home. Thither he transported a portion of his library, in the seclusion of which he now enjoyed a welcome exemption from the incessant interruptions to which he was exposed in Gramercy Park. Graystone soon became, to a far greater extent than he had anticipated, his home. Here he received his friends with a generous hospitality. Though ceasing to take any responsibility for the leadership of the party, his views of public matters continued to be sought and his judgment deferred to as much as ever. He appeared rarely before the public, though scarcely an editor in the land ventured to send his paper to press without some allusion to him. In the fall of 1877 he consented to preside at a dinner given to the late J.S. Morgan, then head of the banking house of J.S. Morgan and Company, of London. In the course of the speech, in which he proposed the health of Mr. Morgan, he referred, in a humorous way, to the very small share that the proprietors of colossal fortunes can appropriate to their personal use. It is the only instance, I believe, of his ever alluding in a public discourse or paper to the burdens or perquisites of wealth. I remember, when I was quite a young man, being sent for by one of the ablest men I have ever known, a great statesman and a great thinker, Martin Van Buren, who wanted to consult me about his will. Well, I walked with him all over his farm one afternoon, and I heard what he had to say, with the previous knowledge, not from him, that I was trustee under his will. The next morning, as I stood before his broad and large wood fire, I stated that result of my reflections. I said, "It is not well to be wiser than events, to attempt to control the far future, which no man can foresee, to trust one's grandchildren, whom one does not know, out of distrust, without special cause, of one's children, whom one does know." I came home, and after a week I received a letter from him stating that he had thought much about the suggestion as to attempting to be wiser than events, and had abandoned all the complicated trusts by which he had proposed tying up his property, and he submitted to me a simple form according to the laws of the land and the laws of nature, which was approved and adopted. I went down to Roehampton last summer to see the beautiful country home of my friend Mr. Morgan, a few miles out of London. He was well pleased to show me about everywhere. No man could help being delighted with what I saw, and he was curious to know what were my impressions. Well, I had, while inspecting with pleasure the appliances of comfort and luxury, been thinking how much, after all, he got for himself out of his great wealth and great business, how much he was able to apply to his own use, what sort of wages he got for managing the great establishment at number 22 Old Broad Street, in London, and I said to him, "I don't see but what you are trustee here, you get only your food, your clothing, your shelter. Of course a man may have some delight in a sense of power, in a sense of consequence, but I rather thought his coachman beat him in that particular. And, on the whole, I thought aloud, I could not help it. I told him he was a trustee with a very handsome salary, doing very well, but I could not see that he got much more than any of the rest of the people about the place. Well, I did hear, when, soon after, I went down to 22 Old Broad Street, that he was rather late to business the next morning. But I will do him the justice to say that he faithfully applied himself to his duties as trustee, and that he was diligent as though he had some personal interest in the great affairs he is managing. Mr. Tilden was invited to dine with the Democratic Association of Massachusetts, on the anniversary of Washington's birthday in 1880. General Grant was still a candidate for the presidency for a third term, and was warmly supported by the Republicans of Massachusetts. In his letter excusing his absence, Mr. Tilden took an opportunity of repeating his views of third-term candidates for the presidency. He said, "Nothing could be more fit at the present time than to commemorate that day. It was the father of his country, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, who set the original example against a third term in presidential office. He made that memorable precedent as a guide to all his successors, and as an unwritten law of the American people. He did so in the light of a prevalent fear in the minds of the most ardent of the patriots who have achieved our national independence, and created our system of free government, that indefinite re-eligibility would degenerate into a practical life tenure. The vast power acquired by the federal government over the elections by its office holders, its patronage, the money it levies, and its various forms of corrupt influence, have developed this danger, until it darkens the whole future of our country. In the choice between the Republic and the Empire, we must believe that the people will be true to their ancestry and to mankind." Mr. Tilden continued to be regarded as the necessary and inevitable candidate of his party for the presidency in 1880. The name of no other candidate was seriously discussed. He was persecuted with unrelenting virulence by the administration, and the Republicans' press neglected no opportunity of refreshing the memory of its readers in regard to his imputed capacities for wickedness, and the wholly imaginary value of his public services. The Democratic press and politicians, on the other hand, continued to speak of his nomination as a matter of course, though without any authority from Mr. Tilden that he desired, or even would accept, a renomination if tendered. They knew, of course, that he would accept a renomination if his health would permit, and the evidence of unimpaired mental power and political resource he was constantly displaying caused his health to be regarded by the public as a very insignificant factor in the case. It was not so with Mr. Tilden, however. He wished a renomination and an opportunity of proving, by his re-election, that the country had been fraudulently deprived of its choice for the presidency in 1876. He was slow in making up his mind that he was unequal to the worries of a candidate, or for the more serious responsibilities of a chief magistrate. But however blind his partisans and friends were or pretended to be about his health, he had no longer any illusions upon the subject himself. He was fully conscious, in the winter of 1879–80, that his health had been steadily failing since 1876, and that the most his medical advisers had done or hoped to do was to retard a little the ravages of the disease, which was held by the profession generally to be an incurable thought, usually a lingering one. I had been trying to assist him one day, early in the spring of 1880, in one of his vexatious litigations. I observed that he did not seem to have the full command of his resources. At last he rose from his seat, and with an air of discouragement on his face as well as in the tone of his voice, said, "Let us go and take a ride." As we rode up the avenue and after a protracted silence he spoke of the decline of force and intellectual endurance, of which he had just experienced such unequivocal evidence, and then added in a rather querulous tone, as if responding to some unwelcome pressure from without, "If I am no longer fit to prepare a case for trial, I am not fit to be President of the United States." He then turned and looked at me to tell him what I had to say in my defense. "Governor," I replied, "I am the last person in the world to urge you to run for the presidency. No one has a right to ask you to accept such a burden at the risk of your life, and there is no use in trying to disguise the fact that there is nothing which would more imperil your health than the inevitable excitement of a canvass for the presidency and the first 6 months' service to which an election would expose you. I think from this day forth he had satisfied himself that he did not wish to be a candidate for the presidency, and was determined not to be a party to any proceedings designed to make him president. He said to me on another occasion, "It takes all my time to live," so numerous were the hygienic precautions he found it necessary to take to meet the inevitable demands upon his strength even as a private citizen. His farm and his library were now to him what the Muse was to Pope, his chief reliance in helping him through that long disease, his life. Though conscious that it was as much as his life was worth to accept a renomination, the consequences to the party of refusing to run put on every day a more serious and perplexing aspect. Friends from every part of the country were telling him that he was the only one who could keep the party together. The Democratic press, with practical unanimity, refused to consider the chances of any other candidate, while the defeat of Robinson for governor in New York, at the fall election, had made the success of any new candidate extremely doubtful. But what at that time weighed more, perhaps, than any of these considerations with Mr. Tilden was the apprehension that if he withdrew, the friends of Mr. Hendricks might profit by the vis inertia of the old ticket, and insist upon his being placed at its head, which could only have resulted in disaster if the electoral vote of New York State should prove necessary to success, and that it would prove necessary at that time no practical politician entertained a doubt. It was a profounder sense of the difficulties of either course, running or withdrawing, than was possessed, perhaps, by any other statesman in the country that led him to defer until the meeting of the convention in June the promulgation of his desire not to be regarded as a candidate for a renomination. His letter, addressed to the delegates of New York on this occasion, is in some respects one of the most impressive papers that ever came from the pen of any American statesman. Mr. Tilden's letter declining a renomination to the presidency. To the delegates for the state of New York to the Democratic National Convention. Your first assembling is an occasion on which it is proper for me to state to you my relations to the nomination for the presidency, which you and your associates are commissioned to make in behalf of the Democratic Party of the United States. Having passed my early years in an atmosphere filled with traditions of the war which secured our national independence, and of the struggles which made our constitutional system of government for the people, by the people, I learned to idealize the institutions of my country, and was educated to believe it the duty of a citizen of the Republic to take his fair allotment of care and trouble in public affairs. I fulfilled that duty to the best of my ability for 40 years as a private citizen. Although during all my life, giving at least as much thought and effort to public affairs as to all other objects, I have never accepted official service except for a brief period, for a special purpose, and only when the occasion seemed to require of me that sacrifice of private preferences to public interests. My life has been substantially that of a private citizen. It was, I presume, the success of efforts, in which as a private citizen I had shared, to overthrow a corrupt combination then holding dominion in our metropolis, and to purify the judiciary which had become its tool, that induced the democracy of the state of 1874 to nominate me for governor. This was done in spite of the protests of a minority, that the part one had borne in those reforms had created antagonisms fatal to me as a candidate. I felt constrained to accept the nomination as the most certain means of putting the power of the gubernatorial office on the side of reform, and of removing the impression, wherever it prevailed, that the faithful discharge of one's duty as a citizen is fatal to his usefulness as a public servant. The breaking up of the canal ring, the better management of our public works, the large reduction of taxes, and other reforms accomplished during my administration, doubtless occasioned my nomination for the presidency by the democracy of the Union, in the hope that similar processes would be applied to the federal government. From the responsibilities of such an undertaking, appalling as it seemed to me, I did not feel at liberty to shrink. In the canvass which ensued, the Democratic Party represented reform in the administration of the federal government, and a restoration of our complex political system to the pure ideals of its founders. Upon these issues the people of the United States, by a majority of more than 250,000, chose a majority of the electors to cast their votes for the Democratic candidates for President and Vice President. It is my right and privilege here to say that I was nominated and elected to the presidency absolutely free from any engagement in respect to the exercise and of its powers or the disposal of its patronage. Through the whole period of my relation to the presidency I did everything in my power to elevate and nothing to lower moral standards in the competition of parties. By what nefarious means the basis of a false count was laid in several of the states, I need not recite. These are now matters of history, about which, whatever diversity of opinion may have existed in either of the great parties of the country at the time of their consummation, has since practically disappeared. I refuse to ransom from the returning boards of Southern states the documentary evidence, by the suppression of which and by the substitution of fraudulent and forged papers, a pretext was made for the perpetration of a false count. The constitutional duty of the two houses of Congress to count the electoral votes as cast, and give effect to the will of the people as expressed by their suffrages, was never fulfilled. An electoral commission, for the existence of which I have no responsibility, was formed, and to it the two houses of Congress abdicated their duty to make the count, by a law enacting that the count of the commission should stand as lawful unless overruled by the concurrent action of the two houses. Its false count was not overruled, owing the complicity of a Republican Senate with the Republican majority of the Commission. Controlled by its Republican majority of 8-7, the Electoral Commission counted out the men elected by the people. That subversion of the election created a new issue for the decision of the people of the unit all questions of administration. It involved the vital principle of self-government through elections by the people. The immense growth of the means of corruption influence over the ballot box, which is at the disposal of the party having possession of the executive administration, had already become a present evil and a great danger, tending to make elections irresponsive to public opinion, hampering the power of the people to change their rulers, and enabling the men holding the machinery of government to continue and perpetuate their power. It was my opinion in 1876 that the opposition attempting to change the administration needed to include at least 2/3 of the votes at the opening of the canvass in order to retain a majority at the election. If after such obstacles had been overcome, and a majority of the people had voted to change the administration of their government, the men in office could still procure a false count founded upon frauds, perjuries, and forgeries, furnishing a pretext of documentary evidence on which to base that false count, and if such a transaction were not only successful, but if, after allotment of its benefits were made to its contrivers, abettors, and apologist by the chief beneficiary of the transaction, it were condoned by the people, a practical destruction of elections by the people would have been accomplished. The failure to install the candidates chosen by the people, a contingency consequent upon no act or omission of mine, and beyond my control, has left me for the last 3 years, and until now, when the Democratic Party by its delegates in National Convention assembled shall choose a new leader, the involuntary but necessary representative of this momentous issue. As such, denied the immunities of private life, without the powers conferred by public station, subject to unceasing falsehoods and calumnies from the partisans of an administration laboring in vain to justify its existence, I have, nevertheless, steadfastly endeavored to preserve to the Democratic Party of the United States the supreme issue before the people for their decision next November, whether this shall be a government by the sovereign people through elections, or a government by discarded servants holding over by force and fraud. And I have withheld no sacrifice and neglected no opportunity to uphold, organize, and consolidate against the enemies of representative institutions, the great party which alone under God can effectually resist their overthrow. Having now borne faithfully my full share of labor and care in the public service, and wearing the marks of its burdens, I desire nothing so much as an honorable discharge. I wish to lay down the honors and toils of even quasi-party leadership, and to seek the repose of private life. In renouncing renomination for the presidency, I do so with no doubt in my mind as to the vote of the state of New York, or of the United States, but because I believe that it is a renunciation of re-election to the presidency. To those who think my renomination and re-election indispensable to an effectual vindication of the right of the people to elect their rulers, violated in my person, I have accorded as long as a reserve of my decision as possible, but I cannot overcome my repugnance to enter into a new engagement which involves 4 years of ceaseless toil. The dignity of the presidential office is above a merely personal ambition, but it creates in me no illusion. Its value is as great a power for good to the country. I said 4 years ago in accepting the nomination. Knowing as I do, therefore, from fresh experience, how great the difference is between gliding through an official routine and working out a reform of systems and policies, it is impossible for me to contemplate what needs to be done in the federal administration without an anxious sense of the difficulties of the undertaking. If summoned by the suffrages of my countrymen to attempt this work, I shall endeavor, with God's help, to be the efficient instrument of their will. Such a work of renovation after many years of misrule, such a form of systems and policies, to which I would cheerfully have sacrificed all that remained to me of health and life, is now, I fear, beyond my strength. With unfeigned thanks for the honors bestowed upon me, with a heart swelling with emotions of gratitude to the democratic masses for the support which they have given to the cause I represented, and for their steadfast confidence in every emergency, I remain, your fellow citizen, Samuel J. Tilden. This was not such a letter as Mr. Tilden would probably have written had he desired to render his renomination impossible. He was too accomplished a politician not to know that it was not only the true, but the only wise, policy for the Democratic Party to renominate the old ticket and to give the loyal men of all parties an opportunity of administering a national rebuke to those who had participated in or connived at the usurpation of the chief magistracy. Failure to renominate the old ticket was to deprive the party of a vital issue which had already been made, which could not be shirked, which, not bravely to meet, was equivalent to a capitulation, and would in all probability prove fatal to any other candidate that could be nominated. That Mr. Tilden would have accepted the nomination if tendered to him, no one is competent to affirm or deny. He probably did not know himself. I was under the impression, derived rather from anything he disclosed of his, that he wished the nomination to be offered him to save the fraud issue for his party, intending, if offered, to decline it, a course which, had I been consulted, I should certainly have advised. As I was driving with him one day near the close of December in 1879, he said to me, "I must talk with someone, but what I am going to say you must not allow to influence your conduct." He then said, referring to the condition of his health, that he did not see how it was possible for him to go through the excitement of another political canvass. I felt that the idea then in his mind was, that for the sake of the party he must not act as though he were not to run, but he did not wish me to labor under false impression in regard to his purposes or expectations. Had the convention nominated him it would probably have paid no attention to his declension, presuming from his character that he would do nothing unnecessarily embarrassing to his party. Had he promptly declined a renomination, as I believe he would have done, there is little doubt that the gallant soldier who was nominated, had he in the emergency been called to take his place on the ticket, would have been elected by a larger majority than Tilden himself had in 1876. There were too many candidates for the presidency among the members of the convention, however, and too little time for reflection, to permit this, which was so obviously the true policy, to prevail. For this, Mr. Manning, the chairman of the delegation, was partly responsible. He telegraphed Mr. Tilden to know if he might yield to the pressure for his renomination which had been stimulated by the publication of his letter. To this Mr. Tilden could make but one reply, and unless such a reply was desired, it was very indiscreet to ask the question. It ran as follows: June 24, 1880. Honorable Daniel Manning. Grand Hotel, Cincinnati, O. Received your telegram and many others containing like information. My action was well considered and is irrevocable. No friends must be allowed to cast a doubt on my motives or my sincerity. This, of course, rendered his renomination impossible. The convention finally, and after much confusion, united upon Major General Hancock, who, in point of fact, was the preference or first choice of but a very small proportion of the convention. The committee appointed to wait upon and notify the candidates of their nomination called upon Mr. Tilden to present to him an engrossed copy of the resolutions adopted by the convention. On this occasion Governor Stevenson, of Virginia, the chairman of the committee, read to him the ninth, which ran as follows. Resolved, that the resolution of Samuel J. Tilden not again to be a candidate for the exalted position to which he was elected by a majority of his countrymen, and from which he was excluded by the leaders of the Republican Party, is received by the democracy of the United States with deep sensibility, and they declare their confidence in his wisdom, patriotism, and integrity unshaken by the assaults of the common enemy, and we further assure him he is followed into the retirement he has chosen for himself by the sympathy and respect of his fellow countrymen, who regard him as one who, by elevating the standard of public morality, and adorning and purifying the public service, merits the lasting gratitude of his country and his party. Then, handing a copy of the resolution to Mr. Tilden, Governor Stevenson continued. That resolution embodies the true sentiment toward you of every Democrat in our land. Take it, as a memorial of their affectionate regard and confidence in your wisdom, statesmanship, and unsullied purity. In conclusion, I bet you, Mr. Tilden, to accept the best wishes of the committee and of myself for your future happiness and prosperity. Mr. Tilden's was neither elaborate nor effusive. He could not have added a word that would have made it a more significant commentary upon the blunder of the convention. He said, M.R. Stevenson, President of the Democratic and National Convention, I thank you for the kind terms in which you have expressed the communication you make to me. A solution which enables the Democratic Party of the United States to vindicate effectively the right of the people to choose their chief magistrate, a right violated in 1876, and, at the same time, relieves me from the burden of a canvass and 4 years of administration, is most agreeable to me. My sincere good wishes and cordial cooperation as a private citizen attend the illustrious soldier whom the democracy have designated as their standard-bearer in the presidential canvass. I congratulate you on the favorable prospects with which that canvass has been commenced, and the promise it affords of complete and final success. In the winter of 1881 Mr. Tilden received from Mr. Hammers, of Gettysburg, a letter announcing the decease of the Honorable Isaac Hearter, a member of the State Senate of Pennsylvania, and a devoted friend of Mr. Tilden, whom, during the presidential canvass, Mr. Hammers represents as going with him from house to house in the Mountain District canvassing for the Tilden and Hendricks ticket, and bursting into tears when the decision of the Electoral Commission reached him. Mr. Tilden to Mr. S. S. W. Hammers, Graystone, June 23, 1882. Dear Sir, it was not because I was not interested by your letter advising me of the decease of your lamented friend, the Honorable Isaac Hearter, that I have not sooner answered it, for the purpose has been all the while in my mind to write to you soon as other more pressing duties would permit. The incidents you relate are very touching. The cause which triumphed by the votes of the people in the great national contest of 1876, but which was foully lost in the count of those votes, was the cause of the sons of toil, on their farms and in their workshops, expect no special advantages from government, and only ask that the sunshine of its favor may fall equally upon all. These isolated atoms of human society are not easily combined, and not often truly represented, while the more selfish, active, and intriguing classes are all the while wresting the government from its true functions, and making it a machine to enrich the few at the expense of the many, and then corrupting the administrative services, the legislation, and the elections, in order to hold and enlarge their unjust advantage. The meaning of the people in the election of 1876 was to restore the government to the pure, simple, and just system which the founders of the Republic intended, and which Jefferson exemplified in practice. How deeply the best interests and the most sacred rights of humanity were involved, I doubt not your deceased friend realized, when with you he went from house to house through the mountains of Pennsylvania during the canvass, and when he wept over the destruction, by frauds, perjuries, and the forgery of electoral votes, of the fruits of the victory he had helped to achieve. With my best wishes for your health, prosperity, and happiness, I remain, very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. S. S. W. Hammers, Esquire, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The results of the election in the defeat of Hancock and the triumph of the Republican candidate revealed to the party the mistake it had made, and revived the clamor for the renomination of Mr. Tilden in 1884, a clamor which, despite the private and public protestations of Mr. Tilden and of several of his most intimate friends, practically excluded the consideration of any other candidates. With the abundant evidence which from time to time reached the public from his seclusion at Graystone, of the unimpaired mental force and sagacity of its proprietor, the zeal of the party for his renomination seemed to have received a new and accumulative impulse from the defeat in 1880. Conflicting reports of the condition of his health, adapted to the uses of the respective parties, were eagerly sought for and published, and he continued to be treated by the Republican press as the only formidable candidate of his party up to the very day that another candidate was renominated. Reports were put in circulation by the Republican press, in 1881, that Mr. Tilden proposed to be a candidate for governor again the following year. Ex-Governor Seymour, who had not been able to contemplate with entire satisfaction the precedence which the party had been giving of late years to Mr. Tilden, seems to have not indisposed to countenance these rumors. In reply to a letter from Seymour, Mr. Tilden sent the following reply: Graystone, October 3, 1881. My dear Sir, I have received your letter stating you intended to call on me, and your inability to do so. I should have written to you earlier, except for an illness and the pressure of claims upon my attention during my convalescence. It would have been agreeable to me to have seen you and to have treated you with that frankness and courtesy you have always experienced from me. In respect to your assurance that you would not be a candidate for nomination, if your nomination would be disagreeable to me, and be discountenanced by me, I have to say that I cannot assume any such position. I have neither the right nor the wish to exclude you from a legitimate and honorable competition for any public trust. My practice, when I was at the head of the party organization, was not to become a partisan of any particular candidate, but to confine myself to such advisory suggestions as might seem fit and useful during the deliberations of the convention, to defer largely to the judgment of the best men of the counties found at the convention, in view of the immediate action on the complex considerations which enter into the formation of a collective ticket. I need not say that I have not undertaken any such function on the present occasion, and have not possessed myself of the information to make me competent to such a work. I assume that you have not given credit to the idle fictions of Republican and other newspapers, which ascribe to me a desire to control the nominations and canvass for the present year, with a view to becoming a candidate for the governor next year. The truth is I ran for governor in 1874, simply for the purpose of sustaining the reform movement to which I had given the 3 preceding years, and I should not have continued in the office for a second term in any possible event, nor would I now entertain the idea of returning to it, even if I flattered myself that I would receive a unanimous vote of the people. All I desire for the Democratic Party in the coming canvass is that it shall make the best possible choice of candidates, and do everything to advance the principles of administration, to which I have devoted so many efforts and sacrifices. With cordial good wishes, very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Faithful to the declaration made in this letter, Mr. Tilden took no active part in the election of the candidate for governor, though his preference may have been inferred by his friends who were in control of the nominating convention, from the fact that one of his nephews, and his namesake, who was a delegate from Columbia County, at a critical moment voted for Grover Cleveland. This vote, supposed to reflect Mr. Tilden's preferences, no doubt exerted a controlling influence over the convention and secured Mr. Cleveland's nomination. A few days before the election, Mr. Tilden's addressed to Mr. Manning, the chairman of the State Committee, the following letter commending the nomination: Graystone, October 20, 1882. My dear Sir, I have received your letter, and in reply I hasten to say that, in my opinion, the excellent ticket nominated at Syracuse is auspicious of a reform administration in the executive government of the state. The large classes of independent voters who, during my administration as governor, honored me with their support included many citizens who were then first attracted to take an interest in public affairs, many others who had not been before classified as partisans, and a large number who broke away from their party ties and gave their adhesion to a system of politics which promised to purify administration and to elevate the standard of official morality. They were numerous enough and powerful enough to hold the balance of power in every successive contest. They can now much more easily determine the result in the approaching election. To all these classes, as well as to all others who are in general accord with me as to the principles on which the state ought to be governed, I cordially commend the support of Grover Cleveland and his associate candidates. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. To Daniel Manning, Esquire. The following letter to Mr. Henry Adams, in acknowledgment of his admirable biographies of John Randolph and of Albert Gallatin, betrays the change of interest and occupation to which Mr. Tilden was gradually habituating himself in his new home. Graystone, January 12, 1883. Dear Mr. Adams, I was lately reading your very interesting book concerning John Randolph, and it suggested a desire to look over your work on the New England Federalists. I sent to my library in the city for that book. When I came to look at it, I noticed that it was a presentation copy sent by you to me. I have no recollection of ever before having seen that entry, or having ever acknowledged your courtesy. I write now to repair the seeming want of attention, and to beg you to accept my thanks, not only for the volume you were so kind to send me, but for the great services which you have rendered to the history of our country. I consider your Life of Albert Gallatin as the most valuable contribution which has been made to this department of our literature. I agree with your very high estimate of Mr. Gallatin as a practical statesman. There is a story told of Mr. Choate. It is that at a dinner party in Pennsylvania, where his wit was ruffled by a competition in the exhibition of great men, he gave as a toast, the two really great men of Pennsylvania, Albert Gallatin, of Geneva, and Benjamin Franklin, of Boston. John Randolph's epigrams, which were famous in their day, were as laboriously wrought as the impromptus of Sheridan are shown by Moore to have been. Mr. Van Buren told me that Randolph said to him, "When I get a good think, I boil it down, and boil it down, until I can put it into the apple of my eye, and then I lay it away for use." I hope your father's health has improved. With my best wishes for the health, prosperity, and happiness of yourself and the other members of your father's family, I remain, very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Henry Adams, Esquire. Boston, Massachusetts. As the time approached for the nomination of a candidate for president in 1880 for the purpose of his party to nominate Mr. Tilden threatened to be irresistible. He alone of all the prominent statesmen of his party had seemed, day by day, to expand and to assume continually enlarging proportions in popular estimation. The conviction that he alone could assure the party's success made them deaf to the protestations of Tilden or of his friends that he would not accept the nomination. This feeling was instinctive and universal. It may have been in part founded on the knowledge of the special devotion to him of the working classes, to whose interests he had been faithful for 50 years, the confidence of the business men, who trusted, to his wise and safe policy, and to the peculiar support which the adopted citizens of German origin had uniformly given to him, including large numbers of Republicans as well as Democrats. But still more potential influence was the fact, at length conceded substantially by all parties, that he had been elected in 1876, but fraudulently deprived of office. Each one of the 4 millions of voters who had given him their suffrages felt a sense of personal injury, and an intense desire to punish and to rectify that wrong. This feeling converted each man from being a comparatively indifferent voter, into a proselyting canvasser. In behalf of the man who had been the victim of a great public crime, there was also a widespread disposition among many Republicans who loved fair play, to give their votes on the first opportunity in such a manner as to redress the wrong of 1876. Instances of this kind came within the knowledge of almost every Democratic voter, and the purpose was communicated, in many cases, to Mr. Tilden and to his friends. Accessions from this cause were believed to be very numerous, and were estimated to count by many thousands. So strong was the popular sentiment in favor of Mr. Tilden's renomination in his own state that when the time arrived for the selection of delegates to the state convention which was to choose the delegation to the national convention, those Democrats who were hostile to Governor Cleveland's nomination to the presidency, and who knew that Mr. Tilden did not mean to accept a nomination, began to intrigue for the election of delegates whose first choice was understood to be Mr. Tilden, but were secretly opposed to Cleveland. Several delegates had been elected in this shape, when Mr. Manning called upon me one day early in June, 1884, and expressed the wish that I would accompany him to Graystone. After briefly referring to the political situation, he said that on the Sunday previous he had called upon Governor Cleveland, laid the whole case before him, pressed upon his attention the necessity of doing something at once, to prevent the friends of Mr. Tilden getting heedlessly pledged to other candidates as their second choice, a danger which was imminent so long as a hope of Mr. Tilden's yielding to the wishes of the party was indulged, and finally, that the only way of defeating such a scheme was for Mr. Tilden to signify, before the election of any more delegates, most of whom were to be chosen within the next 8 or 10 days, that he would not be a candidate. Mr. Manning then went on to say that Governor Cleveland promptly expressed the desire that Mr. Manning would go down to Graystone, represent the situation to Mr. Tilden, and consider himself authorized to give Mr. Tilden any assurances he required in regard to the naming of Mr. Cleveland's cabinet should he be elected, and in regard to the conduct of his administration upon the lines of reform which had been traced by Mr. Tilden during and since his election as governor. Mr. Manning said his object in coming to me was to ask me to accompany him to Graystone and assist him in persuading Mr. Tilden, if persuasion should be necessary, to no longer delay a formal announcement of his intentions, already well known to Mr. Manning and myself, not to accept a renomination. I said that I approved entirely of an early publication by Mr. Tilden of his intention not to accept a renomination, that some 2 weeks previous I had written to him at length, urging upon him the inconveniences of permitting the delegates to be elected to the nominating convention in the expectations of making him their candidate, that such a letter had already been written, but the utterance of it had been delayed, partly out of deference to the wishes of friends in Washington, and partly for what seemed the more obvious and appropriate occasion for such a communication, the meeting of the state convention that was to choose the delegates to the national convention. I accompanied Mr. Manning to Graystone, where he stated his errand to Mr. Tilden. Mr. Tilden hesitated a little, partly perhaps, from a natural reluctance to pursue a course which might be construed into an unbecoming interference in behalf of a particular candidate, partly from delicacy about declining a nomination before the state convention had furnished him a suitable pretext for such a step, and partly from a profound sense of the risk the people would run in selecting a man of such limited administrative experience to conduct the government of 60 millions of people. He finally, however, gave Mr. Manning to understand that the state committee would probably hear from him in a day or 2. A letter of declension was sent to Mr. Manning the following day, and appeared in the morning papers of the 12th of June 1884. After referring briefly to the terms in which he declined a renomination in 1880, he said that nothing had occurred in the 4 years which had since elapsed to weaken, but everything to strengthen, the considerations which then induced him to withdraw from public life. That the occasion now to consider the question was an event for which he had no responsibility, that he had never accepted official service except for a brief period, for a special purpose, and only when the occasion seemed to require of him that sacrifice of his personal preferences for the public welfare. That he accepted the nomination for the presidency in 1876 because of the general conviction that his candidacy would best present the issue of reform which the Democratic majority of the people desired to have worked out in the federal government as it had been in that of the state of New York. That the canvass he was desired to undertake would embrace a period of nearly 5 years, the burden of which admitted of no illusions. The close of his letter was conspicuous for its eloquence, pathos, and dignity. At the present time the considerations which induced my action in 1880 have become imperative. I ought not to assume a task which I have not the physical strength to carry through. To reform the administration of the federal government, to realize my own ideal, and to fulfill the just expectations of the people, would indeed warrant, as they could alone compensate, the sacrifices which the undertaking would involve. But, in my condition of advancing years and declining strength, I feel no assurance of my ability to accomplish those objects. I am, therefore, constrained to say, definitely that I cannot now assume the labors of an administration or of a canvass. Undervaluing in nowise that best gift of heaven, the occasion and the power sometimes bestowed upon a mere individual to communicate an impulse for good, grateful beyond all words to my fellow countrymen who would assign such a beneficent function to me, I am consoled by the reflection that neither the Democratic party, nor the Republic for whose future that party is the best guarantee, is now or ever can be dependent upon any one man for their successful progress in the path or a noble destiny. Having given to their welfare whatever of health and strength I possessed, or could borrow from the future, and having reached the term of my capacity for such labors as their welfare now demands, I but submit to the will of God in deeming my public career forever closed. This letter was like a rainbow set in the political horizon, the harbinger of comparative peace for Mr. Tilden. It served nobody's purpose longer to assail him, and those who had assailed him most virulently seemed disposed to profit by the appearance of this letter to do what they could, and as fast as possible, to assist the public in forgetting their past injustice. Even the New York Times, which for the previous 8 years had blinded itself to all of Mr. Tilden's virtues in its intemperate search for pretexts to revile him, resumed at once the tone of decorous respect to which it had been habituated while laboring with Mr. Tilden some dozen years before municipal reform. Said the Times of the 12th, in which Mr. Tilden's letter appeared, the vital point in what Mr. Tilden writes is his assertion that he cannot now assume the labors of an administration or of a canvass. The assertion is made, it is fair to say, in full knowledge of the fact that in many states of the Union the Democratic Party, without preliminary inquiry as to Mr. Tilden's wishes of Mr. Tilden's strength, had spoken almost without a dissenting voice in favor of his nomination at Chicago. He puts away a presidential nomination he might have had, an act which has few precedents in the history of parties in this country. That act is extremely creditable to the good sense and to the clear perception of Mr. Tilden. He is the best judge of his own strength, and his judgment is blinded by none of those dazzling illusions to which so many men are subject whenever and as often as the presidency comes even remotely within the range of their vision. Nor has his decision been in any way influenced by recent Republican action, for it is now more than a year since Mr. Tilden gave an intimation, in a quarter which left no doubt or question as to his entire earnestness, of his fixed purpose to adhere to the conclusion stated in his letter of June 18, 1880. It would be but a slight recognition of Mr. Tilden's motives and of the circumstances under which his letter is written to say that his act is an unselfish one. It is more than unselfish. In the present divided condition of the Republican Party it is an act of great moment and promise. It is a curious illustration of the extraordinary hold which Tilden's name had upon his party that but for the belief that the time chosen for the publication of his letter signified a desire for the nomination of Mr. Cleveland, the chances were even that he would have been nominated in spite of it. Of 22 states which held their conventions before the publication of the letter, 20 either instructed their delegates to vote for him, or by resolution declared him to be their preference, or appointed delegates known to favor his nomination. One of the remaining two, although nominally favoring a state candidate in the belief that Mr. Tilden did not mean to run, was really favorable to his nomination. Of 14 states which held their conventions after the appearance of the letter, 5 either declared for his nomination or expressed their continued preference for him, while 9 other appointed delegates, of whom he was their first choice. New York State held its convention on the 18th of June, 6 days after publication of his letter, and after delegates had been appointed from all the counties favorable to his renomination. The remaining one of the 38 states then composing the Union, and which held its convention on the 17th of June, accepted Mr. Tilden's letter as final, and appointed delegates favorable to its state candidates. I think Mr. Tilden resisted the importunities of his friends as much through fear of the consequences of a canvass to himself as to the party. His health would have become the controlling issue in the contest. 1 His feebleness would have been exaggerated by his opponents. This would have compelled his appearances in public places, and his exposure at inconvenient times and to imprudent fatigues, the results of which might have left the party in the midst of the battle without a leader. Only a few months after the election he told me that he thought he should live about 2 years longer. He overestimated his longevity by a few months. It was there from no selfish consideration, from no lack of deference for the judgment of others, from no mistrust of his popularity in the country, that he did not allow himself to be moved by the importunities of his partisans. He knew better than anyone else the risks that would be incurred by his renomination, and he was too wise a man to assume that his party was lacking men abundantly competent to lead it with success. Mr. Blaine had already been nominated for the presidency by the Republican Party, and Governor Cleveland was finally nominated by the Democratic Party, and elected. The convention which nominated Mr. Cleveland signalized its deliberations by inserting in its Declaration of Principles the following tribute to its retired leader. Bigelow note: shortly after Mr. Cleveland's nomination I was assured by one of the more prominent delegates to the National Convention from a southern state that but for the impressions prevailing in the convention that Mr. Cleveland was Mr. Tilden's choice for the nomination, he would not have received a single vote. With profound regret we have been apprised by the venerable statesman, through whose person was struck that blow at the vital principle of republics, acquiescence in the will of the majority, that he cannot permit us again to place in his hands the leadership of the democratic hosts, for the reason that the achievement of reform in the administration of the federal government is an undertaking now too heavy for his age and failing strength. Rejoicing that his life has been prolonged until the general judgment of our fellow countrymen is united in the wish that that wrong were righted in his person, for the democracy of the United States, we offer to him in his withdrawal from public cares not only our respectful sympathy and esteem, but also that best homage of freemen, the pledge of our devotion to the principles and the cause now inseparable in the history of this republic from the labors and the name of Samuel J. Tilden. The convention also unanimously adopted the following resolutions: resolved, that this convention has read with profound regret and intense admiration the statesmanlike and patriotic letter of Samuel J. Tilden expressing the overpowering and providential necessity which constrains him to decline a nomination for the highest office in the gift of the American people. Resolved, that though fraud, force, and violence deprived Samuel J. Tilden and Thomas A. Hendricks of the offices conferred upon them by the Democratic Party of the nation in 1876, they yet lived, and ever will, first in the hearts of democracy of the country. Resolved, that this convention expresses a nation's regret that this same lofty patriotism and splendid executive and administrative ability which cleansed and purified the city and state governments of the great empire state cannot now be turned upon the Augean stable of national fraud and corruption so long and successfully maintained by the Republican Party at the national capital. Resolved, that copies of these resolutions be suitably engrossed, and that the chairman of the convention appoint a committee whose duty it shall be, in the name of the convention, to forward or present the same to the Hon. Samuel J. Tilden and the Honorable Thomas A. Hendricks. The chairman of the convention, in compliance with its instructions, appointed a committee consisting of one delegate from each state to wait upon Mr. Tilden and present him with an engrossed copy of these resolutions. The committee assembled in New York on the 3rd day of September, whence they were conveyed to Yonkers in Mr. Tilden's steam yacht, the Viking, which had been placed at their disposal. The resolutions were communicated to Mr. Tilden, with a few appropriate remarks by the Hon. R. Henry, of Mississippi, chairman of the committee. Mr. Tilden briefly expressed his thanks, and said that the state of his health compelled him to ask of the committee the indulgence of a few days for a more formal reply. On the 6th of October he addressed the committee a letter the burden of which was the characteristics by which the Democratic Party had been distinguished from the Republican Party from their foundations respectively. Of the latter his view is substantially presented in the following paragraphs. The Democratic Party had its origin in the efforts of the more advanced patriots of the Revolution to resist the perversion of our government from the ideal contemplated by the people. Among its conspicuous founders are Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, of Massachusetts, George Wythe and James Madison, of Virginia. From the election of Mr. Jefferson as president in 1800, for 60 years the Democratic Party mainly directed our national policy. It extended the boundaries of the Republic, and laid the foundations of all our national greatness, while it preserved the limitations imposed by the Constitution and maintained a simple and pure system of domestic administration. On the other hand, the Republican Party has always been dominated by principles which favor legislation for the benefit of particular classes at the expense of the body of the people. It has become deeply tainted with the abuses which naturally grow up during a long possession of unchecked power, especially in a period of civil war and false finance. The patriotic and virtuous in it are now unable to emancipate it from the sway of selfish interests which subordinate public duty to personal gain. The most hopeful of the best citizens it contains, despair of its amendment except through its temporary expulsion from power. It has been boastingly asserted by a modern Massachusetts statesman, struggling to reconcile himself and his followers to their presidential candidate, that the Republican Party contains a disproportionate share of the wealth, the culture, and the intelligence of the country. The unprincipled Grafton, when taunted by James II with his personal want of conscience, answered, "That is true, but I belong to a party that has a great deal of conscience." Such reasoners forget that the same claim has been made in all ages and countries by the defenders of old wrongs against new reforms. It was alleged by the Tories of the American Revolution against the patriots of that day. It was repeated against Jefferson and afterwards against Jackson. It is alleged by the conservatives against those who, in England, are now endeavoring to enlarge the popular suffrage. All history shows that reforms in government must not be expected from those who sit serenely on the social mountain tops enjoying the benefits of the existing order of things. Even the divine author of our religion found his followers, not among the self-complacent Pharisees, but among the lowly-minded fishermen. Of all American statesmen who have risen to eminence, Mr. Tilden was probably the least given to sarcastic or personally offensive allusions of any kind to a political opponent. I am not aware that in all his long public life he ever had an unpleasant personal controversy about any words that fell from his lips or pen. No one knew him better than he, nor acted more uniformly upon the knowledge, that, whoso keepeth his mouth and tongue, keepeth his soul from troubles. He would not, therefore, have made the reflections upon some of the unfortunate events in the congressional career of the Republican candidate which is disguised in this paragraph had not Mr. Blaine stimulated the malicious persecutions with which the administration had pursued him so relentlessly from the dawn to the close of his candidature for the presidency, and merely, as Mr. Tilden believed, because Mr. Blaine regarded him as his most formidable rival. End of Chapter 8. Please share, like, subscribe and hit the notification bell for updates to the Samuel Tilden series.